Everyone gird your loins, because today I have a review of two queer horror anthologies. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I just have a quick review of two queer horror anthologies called The Book of Queer Saints Volume 1 and Volume 2. And now, to be honest, I'm not even sure how I found these. I think the algorithm just showed them to me on Amazon, and the cover stood out and jumped out at me. And so I'll put the cover up on the screen. It's a little bit spicy, so I won't leave it up there too long. Once I saw them, and then I saw that they had short stories by people like Haley Piper and Eric LaRocca, then I was in. Let me tell you a little bit about them. These were both edited by Mae Murray, and the first one was originally published through Kickstarter. It actually was nominated for a British Fantasy Award for Best Anthology, and one of the short stories won a British Fantasy Award for Best Short Fiction. And because of that, the book was really successful, and so Mae Murray started her own micro press called Medusa Publishing House, spelled Haus. I'll put a link in the description, and she republished it with this new cover, and she was able to publish a second volume as well. So the first volume has 13 stories in it. Second volume has 19 stories. It's about 400 pages. So they're short, and between the two volumes, you have almost every subgenre of horror covered. The thing with anthologies is that I don't expect every story in an anthology to be perfect. And in fact, if an anthology has one or two great stories that really blow me away, and then a few good ones, and the rest are just mediocre, and even a few duds mixed in, I call that a win. I'm happy with that. Both of these anthologies, every single story is good. And there's multiple great stories in each anthology. What Mae Murray has done in each of these volumes is that each volume has three kind of well-known or well-established horror authors, and then the rest are all unknown or up-and-coming authors. So in Volume 1, you have stories by Haley Piper and Eric LaRocca and Joe Koch. And in the second volume, you have stories from Paula Diash and Sam Richard and Alison Rumfitt. So those are all names that a lot of contemporary horror readers will be familiar with, but the rest of the authors are relatively unknown, and yet every single one writes a good story. I had fun with every story in the collection. What I thought I would do is, I'm not going to review every single story, because that would take all day. I just want this to be a quick review. So what I thought I would do is just briefly talk about one of the stories in each of these volumes that isn't by one of the well-known authors, just so you have a taste of what is in here. In Volume 1, I thought I would talk briefly about the story called Macrame Flames by Eric Raglan. So in Macrame Flames, we follow a group of occultists, queer bikers that call themselves the Queer Horrors, and they are convinced that if they burn down 666 Hobby Lobbies, then Satan will rise up from hell and it'll usher in hell on earth, and that's their goal. And so they commit arson all throughout the US, and they finish their goal, and of course nothing happens. So they kind of disband and go their own ways. And when the story starts, or when it picks up, is they've realized they've only burnt down 665, so they still have to pull one more gig. And our main protagonist is going to the suburbs because his former boyfriend has left the gang and joined the suburbs and is now a carpenter living this boring life. He has to convince him to come back so they can pull one more gig to usher in hell on earth. And the story goes from there. It's a lot of fun. It's exciting. You get a little bit of steamy scenes in the suburbs, as well as, arson. So can't go wrong with that. And then a story in this volume, in Volume 2, that I thought I'd highlight is called The Trans Mask of the Red Death by Elsie von Hessen. So obviously it's a play on The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. And it's similar. It starts with a masquerade ball in a grand ballroom, and the showman, or the performer, who is the entertainment, is called Jack of Diamonds. And he's like a leather daddy who is a trans mask leather daddy. And he puts on a show that is full of sex and violence with an emphasis on the violence. And one of the waiters who is serving this, country club elite event falls in lust with Jack of Diamonds, and they form a relationship, and things kind of get more violent from there. It was a lot of fun. And within the two volumes, so many subgenres of horror are represented, from body horror, which is what we often expect with queer horror, but also psychological horror, and so there's some folk horror, a little bit of cosmic horror, some revenge horror, maybe a little bit of erotic horror. It covers the whole spectrum. After reading the first volume, My only complaint was that even though it had a good selection of horror and I loved all the stories, I felt it could have been a little more gooey, you know? It wasn't quite as bloody and gory as I wanted. There's a lot of violence, um, but, you know, I thought it could have been a little more, it could have pushed the boundaries a little more. And then the second volume came, and the second volume did that in spades. So the two volumes work really well together, and I recommend both of them. I think they're both great. And if you want to know kind of the driving ethos of the books, I think it's explained really well in the foreword of the first one. The foreword is written by Sam Richard, who's also one of the authors, and he writes, "Queer writers don't owe you squeaky clean queer characters or stories. They don't owe you the type of representation that we're routinely told is important and revolutionary when it comes to major multimedia corporations inserting a 2-second long chaste kiss between queer characters, then never addressing it again, as if that's a meaningful representation. If that's the only queer representation we're allowed, then we're doomed. The writers in this book are a solution to that doom. This is a book full of queer representation that is messy and ugly and uncomfortable and painful. It's a book full of queer characters who are cruel and conflicted and complex and interesting. Yes, queer joy, but also queer rage, queer hostility, queer panic, queer madness, queer violence, queer horror." So that is the driving spirit between both of these books. We have monsters and anti-heroes filling the pages, and they're a delight. Now, to be clear, I've read quite a few collections of queer horror anthologies, and they almost all have that driving ethos. They're very similar in that way. I've probably read a half dozen anthologies of queer horror, and I have another half dozen or so waiting on my Kobo that I'll be reading soon. I think there's a really interesting relationship between queerness and horror that we find not only in these volumes, but just in the attraction to horror stories and to transgressive fiction in general among queer people. And I think not only queer people, I think it's probably similarly true for members of any historically marginalized or oppressed community, but I can't speak to those. I can speak to the queer community. And I think part of the reason we're so attracted to horror is because we see ourselves in the monsters. We know what it's like to be ostracized and persecuted for things that are outside of our control. We're used to being told that we belong in the shadows. We see the monsters in horror fiction, and we see ourselves in those monsters. And so because of that, I think there is a way that queer people see themselves reflected in horror fiction that is profound and can be affirming in many ways. Whenever I think about looking in the face of a monster and seeing yourself, I actually think of a quote from a book called On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, who is a Vietnamese-American poet and author. And it's a decidedly not a horror book, but it is a fictionalized autobiography of his life. And it's all written as a series of letters to his mother. And part of the tragedy of that format is that his mother doesn't speak English, and he writes all these letters to her in English. And if you'll indulge me, there's a small quote that always comes to mind when I think of looking in the face of monsters. I'm going to edit it down because this isn't a review of that book. At the time, while pruning a basket of green beans over the sink, you said, out of nowhere, "I'm not a monster. I'm a mother." The morning closed in around us. I put down the book. The heads of the green beans went on snapping. They thunked in the steel sink like fingers. "You're not a monster," I said. But I lied. What I really wanted to say was that a monster is not such a terrible thing to be. From the Latin root monstrum, a divine messenger of catastrophe, then adapted by the Old French to mean an animal of myriad origins, centaur, griffin, satyr. To be a monster is to be a hybrid signal, a lighthouse, both shelter and warning at once. Days later, a neighborhood boy riding by on his bike would see me in the front yard while you were at work. At recess the next day, the kids would call me freak, fairy, fag. I would learn much later that those words were also iterations of monster. You're a mother, Ma. You're also a monster. But so am I. You know, that quote sums up for me this relationship I think queer people have with horror imagery and with horror stories. Is that we see ourselves in the downtrodden. We see ourselves in the abused. And instead of allowing that to hold us down, we use that to empower us, to create art that shows that we are more than our trauma and we are more than the abuse that we experience. And that's the same reason I think queer people are attracted to transgressive fiction as well. What's the point of transgressive fiction? Transgressive fiction is looking at society's status quo and saying, I don't want to have anything to do with your status quo. I don't want your normal, because normal is not only boring, normal is a death sentence. Normal is destructive. And so part of queer identity for many people, especially radical queer identity and radical queer politics, is not trying to be normal, is trying to disrupt the whole concept of normal. There's a famous saying in queer rights activism, and it's been around for decades, and I don't know who started it, but it says, not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck you. That is the spirit that queer people bring to transgressive fiction. And it's the spirit we bring to horror fiction, is that we don't want your normalcy. We don't want to be like everyone else. We want to be ourselves loudly, proudly, destructively, emotionally, full of joy, full of laughter, and full of life. These stories reflect that struggle, they reflect that experience, but these aren't stories that preach, they're stories that are a bloody good time. They are a lot of fun. I really hope you check them out. The Book of Queer Saints, Volume 1 and Volume 2. So let me know if you have read these or you plan on reading them, or if there are other queer horror anthologies that you like. I'd love to hear about them. I'm always looking for more, so let me know down in the comments. But for now, thank you for coming. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.